Welcome, welcome. Take a seat, please. The presentation is about to start. Yesterday, we have gone over Mythic Plus. We have had our update, since we have ignored, we can say, Mythic Plus and the overall data regarding Mythic Plus for over a month, and now we're going to be doing the same thing to raiding, because that was also ignored for over a month. The participation, the performance of all the specs, if there is something going on, if something has been changing over time, which it has, and we will go over it, but also the overall participation to Castle Nathria. How many guilds or how has the raid progressed in terms of difficulty in these first 3 months, a little over 3 months that the raid has been available, compared to previous expansions, compared to previous raids. Has it gotten easier, harder, or better? What about the participation? Which is something that I think is going to be very interesting, as the removal of free item level gear everywhere because of Titanforging or corruptions or what have you made people more interested in heroic raiding. One of the premises of this change was, I believe, this was going to make heroic more relevant over time, because of course people don't have free gear, don't have high item level from other sources, and they have to continue doing heroic if they want more gear. Now, when we start looking at raiding, and we look at the kills, right, we look at the participation. From Castle Nathria, we have this. We start in the high 30,000s for the first bosses, and we go all the way down to the Nathrius at 13,000 kills. This is after 3 months, about 3 months and like a week of participation. Now, we need to put this in perspective. So let's put it in perspective, for example, with the last raid tier we have gotten. So in terms of time, Nyalotha. So Nyalotha, you can see, if you can count, which I still doubt, by the way, that all of the numbers are smaller than Castle Nathria, except for one, which is the last boss. As it often happens, the last boss being the hardest one, it's going to take a little bit more time to rack up the numbers. What is interesting, though, what is relevant, is that despite Castle Nathria being counted on just 3 months worth of progression, whereas Nyalotha is over like nearly 10 months long, where this lasted, this is still higher in pretty much every single boss kill except for N'Zoth. So the premise seems to be right, seems to at least stay true for the last raid tier. More people are doing Castle Nathria because heroic is more relevant compared to Nyalotha. Nyalotha, of course, had no more Titanforging, but they did have corruption. It had corruption from heroic, but more importantly, it had corruption from Mythic Plus gear, and of course world quests and whatnot. So the value from the heroic pieces of Nyalotha was very, very low, and the result is that compared to Castle Nathria, it has been completed way, way less. What about previous raid tiers? Well, we can go back to, for example, the first raid. Instead of looking at the last one, let's look at the first raid of the expansion, which is often the most relevant, because the first raid is where, the more people are going to jump into the raid. In almost all situations, the first raid is going to have more participation than the second and third raid. So Uldir is going to be more populated, to say, than Battle of the Zarlor or the Eternal Palace. When you look at Uldir, for example, the participation is similar. It is actually higher on average, except, again, for the last boss, Gahun. And then, of course, you can look at the middle ones, you can look at BOD, and you can look at Eternal Palace. BOD, of course, is going to be much, much lower because it's in the middle of their expansion. There's going to be much less guilds progressing, so Castle Nathria completely dwarfs the progression of BOD. Even Jaina is basically almost caught up. The Nathrius has almost caught up with Jaina in terms of kills, and then of course there is Eternal Palace, which is on a similar level. Way more kills in Heroic Castle Nathria. So at least from starting to look at Heroic, you have the first possible statement to make, which is Heroic has been made more relevant. Purely looking at numbers, at data, at facts, being objective, more people are clearing the raid. The raid is more relevant, the loot is more relevant, so the raid is more interesting, has more interest, at least. So then, what about Mythic? Of course, Mythic also starts having the caveat, which is a little bit more difficult, it's a little bit more time-consuming, and requires a little bit more preparation and more effort from the players, so it's not that more people are going to just start raiding 3 times a week to clear Mythic because of the gear. Some people simply can't or won't, as opposed to Heroic raiding, which is, way more casual guilds can dab into heroic raiding. It's much more easy for people to be convinced to jump into heroic raiding for some more loot compared to mythic raiding. So, Mythic Castle Nathria. Mythic Castle Nathria right now looks like this. I had to manually give you this overview because, while progress has been slacking for months, they don't count Chinese guilds, the numbers are all wacky. So these are the actual correct numbers, and the Nathrius is approaching the 300 kills. So, when we look at the other raids compared to Castle Nathria in the first 3 months, because this is way more relevant, it's not going to help us to look at the mythic kills of bosses like 6 months down the line. We have to look at the current situation in the same amount of time, so in 3 months and 1 week, in about 100 days of mythic progression. Okay, let's go again back to the previous raid, and we have Nazot, which has, at this point in time, 580 kills in basically 100 days. You have Ajara from Eternal Palace, which had 460 kills. You have, of course, Gahun, the first raid of the expansion, nerfed multiple times, more so than the Nathrius, 1,200 kills in the first 100 days. And then right after Gahun, you had Jaina, 540-ish kills after the first 100 days. Now, these numbers are telling you, number one, that the Nathrius is quite a bit harder, because when you look at the mythic kills, on average, they are keeping up, so there is more participation and the numbers are higher, but the last boss isn't. And this isn't like the heroic version, where the heroic last boss's numbers are higher because we are looking at kills over the entire tier of the previous expansions compared to just the first 3 months. These are compared in the same amount of days, and all these numbers are still much higher than the Nathrius. They are in the 4 to 5 to 600s and higher, whereas the Nathrius is still not even at 300. So you do have quite a tough last boss, even though the mythic kills throughout the raid are staying pretty healthy and relevant and comparable to the rest of the raid tiers of the previous expansion, couple of expansions. The last boss isn't, I wouldn't say. Now, I would like to add the suggestion, the possible reasoning for this, beyond just saying it's harder, which might as well be true. Although it isn't, because we know that Sludge Fist first and then Stone Legion Generals were harder in progression than the Nathrius. However, the point is, what about loot? Because if you think about it, these couple of expansions, particularly BFA, add a scaling element to the boss kills. You add essences, you add your necklace, even Legion you add your artifact power, you add the possibility over time to find your best in slot legendary, you add Titanforging, you add Warforging, you add Benthic gear, you add corruption. Over time, the boss is getting nerfed, so it's easier. This is the same for the Nathrius, just like for Jaina, and just like for Gahun. That's the same, but the loot isn't. In Castle Nathria, you did not get stronger over time. The only way for you to get stronger over time was to get more loot. And we know how loot has been in this first tier of the expansion. The only other way, the only element of borrowed power in this first tier of Castle Nathria of Shadowlands was your Soulbind. And that's not really a very powerful power you're getting compared to an essence slot, compared to an higher ring of Azerite traits, Azerite ring in BFA, compared to a OP corruption or finding your best in slot legendary. Unlocking an extra row of Soulbind passive slots is like nothing, or a potency slot is nothing compared to that type of power. So that, to me, might be the actual reason, the cause for this, that the boss skills are not ballooning out of control in the later part of the tier like it did in the previous tiers, simply because we don't have the scaling power compared to other expansions. We don't get that much stronger later into the tier like we have in the previous couple of expansions. That, to me, is the reason. Maybe we have a different one, I don't know. I might even say I don't care, but I still want to hear about it, so let me know what you think could be the possible reason, other than just the boss being hard, which is a pretty easy cop-out, a pretty easy explanation. We want to go a little bit deeper than that. Now, past the overall look of the raid progression, let's look at the actual classes and specs and how they have been doing. Since we have left them there for about a month, let's look how it progressed. So, classes and specs in raids. Where did we leave ourselves when it comes to raid? A month ago it looked like this. This was the participation, this was the amount of classes and specs playing in mythic raids as DPS specs. Now, in a month, how has it changed? So, it has changed like this. Now, giving you the quick rundown, the first things that are happening here very clearly are that Windwalker has gotten even higher, that Fury has gotten much higher, at the expense of Arms getting lower. There are also some more subtle changes. For example, Frost Mage. If you look, in the previous, up to a month ago, the participation of Fire Mages in Mythic Raiding was at 35,000 logs to the Frost Mage's 1,400. When you look now, there are 113,000 logs for Mage and 10,000 for Frost. Fire Mages are barely 10 times as popular, so they went from 30 times to 10 times. We will see also why. Windwalker, of course, remember the good old days, as we first started reporting on the rise of popularity and strength, of course, because you don't get popular if you're not at least strong in something. Windwalker was all the way below subtlety, below enhancement, and then they started going up and up and up, and eventually they got past the mud fight in the middle between Havoc, Retribution, Fury, and Arms that were there for quite a long time. The top, of course, has remained the top. It's very difficult to move around once you have so many guilds running with so many of these specs. Marksmanship, Fire, Balance, Affliction, Unholy, and Shadow have been there for months at this point, as well as painful to say the bottom. The only one who actually tried to get away from the bottom is Frost Mage. Anything changing for the other roles? Not too much. For healers, it's the same thing. For healers, you have Restoration Shaman, which is very heavily the more populated one. Holy has been, used a few times, which is why it retains quite a few of these logs, and then Restoration Druid and Mistweaver at the bottom. Of course, we have to mention that Mistweaver is much more at the bottom than Restoration Druid. This has remained the same, not really any major difference. When you look at tanks, this was the expected result. Remember, we left each other just as Vengeance Demon Hunter was about to pass Brewmaster in terms of representation. I also followed up on that the week it actually happened, but now it's much more clear. As you can see for yourself, Vengeance is now actually almost 50% more popular than Brewmaster. There has also been the slight change that Protection Paladin has gotten slightly more popular compared to before, and Blood Decay has started dropping more and more ranks. This is consistent with the lower participation of Blood Decay tanks in Mythic Plus as well, so it followed up a similar pattern in raids. In a similar note, we can say also Guardian Druids. Guardian Druids before, up to a month ago, they were somewhere in the realm of 6 times less played than the first tank, about 5 times less played than the second tank. Now they are just about 4 times less played, 3 times less played. They are also closer to Protection Paladin and Blood Decay than before. That's the only, slight change compared to about 5 weeks ago. But what about the actual DPS? I want to see the numbers. I want to see the rankings. So a month ago it looked like this. A month ago, we have to start with the most obvious thing, okay? A month ago we were talking about this fight for top 3. This King of the Hill elimination deathmatch between Affliction Warlock, Fire Mage, Windwalker, Elemental Shaman, Unholy DK, all there trying to get very high. And this is the situation a month after, 5 weeks actually after. One of them is not like the other. Yes, as you can see, the King of the Hill deathmatch is still ongoing between a few of these specs, except Elemental Shaman is no longer there. Elemental Shaman is now actually below the top half for the first time ever since they got their Best in Slot legendary. What happened? I'm here to explain. I'm here to give you some sort of sense of these type of things that you don't understand, and if you wouldn't get an explanation, you would just take them at face value. Oh, someone dropped 10 ranks, it must be bad. Or it must have been nerfed. Actually, none of this has happened. You have to understand that Mythic raiding only has a certain amount of bosses you can progress, and then the amount of damage you can do is depending on how the boss works. What happens when you go a month through the expansion and you start killing the last bosses being Sludgefist, Stone Legion Generals, and Denatrius? What happens, of course, is if your spec is bad at doing damage on those bosses, it means the more guilds kill them, the more logs are available for those bosses, the worse your spec becomes if your spec is bad. In the case of Elemental Shaman, for example, on Sludgefist is about average, because Sludgefist has a very strong component of burst damage, which Elemental Shaman doesn't really have. So the result is that Elemental Shaman is here on Sludgefist, compared to many of the other, burst-heavy specs, which are all gravitating and orbiting towards the top. Then you move from Sludgefist to Stone Legion Generals, and the result is even worse, because Stone Legion has a ton of adds to deal with. And guess what Elemental Shaman is shit at? Adds. This is, again, for overall damage. It is actually useful and good to have an Elemental Shaman on Stone Legion Generals, just like on Denatrius. The problem is not on overall damage. It's not going to show up in your overall logs, which is luckily not what raid guilds and good raiding guilds and officers and whatnot are going to care for, but for the general populace, for the brainlets who look at this type of graphs, are going to get the wrong impression. Overall damage, of course, is not going to favor specs that don't have free cleave, free AoE damage that can pad the meters, and Elemental Shaman happens to be one of them. When you go to Denatrius, it's the same thing, if not worse, actually. Elemental Shaman on Denatrius basically drops to the absolute bottom. The entire first phase Elemental Shaman is useless when it comes to AoE, and look at that. The top logs, because there is like 4 of them, are Frost DK. I wonder why. So when you look at these logs and then you put them in the average to weigh down a spec which isn't good, this is what happens to Elemental Shaman. The same thing can be said for Balanced Druid. Remember when I explained to you why Balanced Druid, which was falling down to the 6th, 7th and 8th rank on several bosses in the middle of the tier, Hungering Destroyer, Zymox, Inerva, these fights were dropping Balanced Druid lower and lower, and then bam, Council of Blood happens, this happens, and Balanced Druid miraculously goes all the way back to the top. What happens after Council of Blood? After Council of Blood, you have Sludge Fist. Sludge Fist has a very important burst phase, which is where Balanced Druid can hold their own, and Balanced Druid gets in 6th overall damage. And then you have Stone Legion Generals. Stone Legion Generals has a lot of adds for Balanced Druid to take advantage of as well, and then you have the Nathrius, which is also, surprisingly, very good for Balanced Druid, which is also 5th. So from the slipping away from the top that Balance had right before Council of Blood, they get into logging Council of Blood, they get a massive boost in DPS for overall damage, and they are able to keep it until likely the rest of the tier. Basically, Elemental, Shaman and Balanced Druid have gone down the opposite path. Balanced Druid was slipping down, and then they were rescued by favorable boss fights for them to go all the way up to the top. Elemental Shaman was rising at the top due to favorable boss fights, and then unfavorable boss fights at the end dropped him lower and lower. This is unfortunately also a reminiscent situation of Nyalota, where Elemental Shaman on the few last fights was also terrible because of the almost exact same reasons. Lack of AoE DPS, lack of free AoE cleave, which dragged down Elemental on fights like Carapace, on fights like Nezot, even fights like Drestagat or Ilginoth for cleave. So unfortunately, Elemental Shaman is back into this situation. Other specs doing anything new? Well, Frost Mage. We touched on Frost Mage in the population, becoming much more popular than before, from 30 times less popular than Fire to 10 times, and this is also why. You can see Fire Mage is still, of course, the favored DPS spec for mages, but Frost Mage is now much more respectable. On a similar situation, let's bring up these logs again. You can see the damage of a Frost Mage on Sludge Fist, which is towards the top, and then you can see the damage of a Frost Mage on Stone Legion Generals, which is actually at the top. If you don't count that super short green bar at the top, I'm pretty sure it's a bug, then you can see why Frost Mage has gained more popularity. Not many other changes. We left with Beast Mastery and Subtlety and the bottom, and they're still there. We left actually with Arms right as they were being overtaken by Fury, because Fury received more relevant buffs than Arms, and then 1 month later Arms is even lower and Fury is much higher. This was also pointed out in the participation. Arms dropped a lot compared to Fury. They are still not great. It's still not a very good DPS spec for raids, and you're only being brought because you give Battle Shout and nobody wants to use a Protection Warrior. That needs to be made clear. On a similar note, in case you were wondering, Assassination is doing even worse than before. The reason why Assassination is doing worse than before, even though they got buffed something like 3 times between the last time we checked this and now, it's not that the buffs made them even weaker. It's that Assassination is in a very similar situation to Elemental. Assassination is shit at AoE, is shit at burst and hitting multiple targets and free cleaving, so even the few Assassinations which were making it into a raid were not doing great at all in these last few bosses, so they were being left behind. Which is also why Havoc, for example, has gone up a little bit. You know, they have a free bunch of cleave they can bring, which pads the meter on fights like Stone Legion and the Nathrius, and you can see the state of Havoc. Even padding the meters, that's where they are. In the last few expansions, you know, a Havoc padding the meters meant they were at the top. Now, they are not at the top, I can say. You can see most of the other representation has remained the same. For the most part, though, the other specs are still where they were before. They have continued to perform at about the same level. We have gotten also, unsurprisingly, a little bit of a higher ranking on Marksmanship Hunter. Remember, we left Hunter and we were pointing out how hard they were falling down in DPS because we left in the chunk of progression where you were doing a lot of single target bosses, a lot of fights which did not favor Marksmanship's AoE and burst AoE a lot. And then we went into Sludge Fist, which has a very relevant burst phase, and then in Stone Legion Generals, which is a lot of adds, and even the Nathrius, so Marksmanship has been able to climb back a little bit. Overall, these were the most relevant changes, both for DPS as well as healers and tanks. Of course, healers, no real change, actually. They have more or less kept up at the same level as 5 weeks ago. As for tanks, just the pre-planned and expected continued rise of Vengeance Demon Hunter, as well as more representation for Guardian Druids compared to Prot Paladin and Blood Death Knights, particularly Blood Death Knights, getting lower representation over time. So, with this we can close our snippet for raids. This is probably going to be about the last time we do this until towards the end of the tier, where we can draw the final conclusions. Maybe if there is some major changes, for example 9.0.5, we can take a look again, but for the most part, you know, this is how it should stay for a while. Shouldn't really change that much at this point. So, with this, I am going to leave you. See you guys somewhat soon, likely tomorrow. And in the meantime, overall logs are a trap.